Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to take some pretty challenging research and really try to turn that complexity into clarity you can use right away. Today, we're digging into something specific for you, looking at one of the trickiest problems in leadership, really, whether you're in a huge organization or just leading a small team. How do you actually measure growth when it's intangible, internal? We're drawing on sources that talk about discipleship tracking, mapping spiritual growth, but honestly, if you're managing employee development or mentoring programs or trying to shift company culture, these challenges, they're exactly the same. Okay, so let's get into this central tension. There's this fundamental irony, you almost can't avoid it whenever you try to intentionally measure human development. The second you start trying to measure something, especially internal stuff like, say, motivation or character, the measurement process itself starts changing the very thing you're measuring. What you thought would bring clarity often just muddies the waters, complicates things, maybe even corrupts the behavior.
Exactly. And that complication, that's precisely what we need to navigate here. Our mission today isn't to say these systems are failures because, look, measurement is often a necessary part of stewardship. Instead, we want to pinpoint those organizational blind spots, where faith or maybe just human development bumps up against these rigid data structures. We need to see those moments of friction where the process breaks or leaders just get totally frustrated, not as like total crises,
Right.
but as sharpening stones. They actually refine both the tool and the people using it.
That reframing feels really important because friction is kind of inevitable when you try to structure something as fluid as how people grow.
And what's really fascinating is what the research points to as the real key to success. It's not about how complex or, sophisticated your tracking platform is. The organizations that really get this right, the ones that thrive, they're the ones that have built in the agility to troubleshoot, to recalibrate their definitions, to realign their processes like in real time.
They're constantly tweaking it.
Yeah, they treat their system almost like it's always in beta. They're constantly asking leaders, okay, where are you hitting roadblocks? Where is this frustrating? Instead of just forcing the tool down their throats. It's adaptability, not the architecture itself. That's the core skill. Okay, so to really get why these systems can break down so easily, we first need to talk about what the sources call the steward's paradox. This is really the core tension right at the heart of trying to measure this stuff intentionally. On one hand, we're called to be good stewards, measure inputs, manage the process, multiply the impact. That makes sense. But spiritual life, or internal growth, it's ultimately determined by sovereignty or, factors completely outside our direct management control. You have to plan, sure, but you absolutely cannot guarantee the outcome.
Oh, okay.
The classic theological line sums it up. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. You do your part, but the result isn't entirely up to you.
So you've got leaders who are held accountable for results they need to show growth, report on it, but they know deep down they can't actually force that growth to happen. That tension, I imagine, leads straight to inconsistent practices and eventually just confusion across the organization.
Oh, absolutely. The sources give this really powerful example of that inconsistency. So assigning stages of spiritual maturity, like seeker, maturing, leader, sounds perfectly logical on paper. But then you put two experienced leaders in a room looking at the exact same person's data, and they can disagree completely.
Really?
Yeah. One leader sees progress in certain behaviors, assigns a higher stage. The other focuses on maybe some character flaws or sees a plateau in commitment and assigns a lower stage. And that subjective friction, it just breeds doubt in the whole system. It often leads to leaders just quietly ignoring the data altogether.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
I mean, if the experts using the tool can't even agree on what it's telling them, why bother putting the information in?
And that failure to reconcile, it pushes the system onto what the sources call the hidden shoals. These are the main ways these systems fail. The first big one is metrics worship, or sometimes called quantification idolatry. This is what happens when the numbers themselves, the metrics, become the main focus, like the ultimate goal for the organization.
Okay, how does that play out?
Well, think about the mechanism. If you incentivize the easy-to-count stuff, classes attended, sign-ups, baptisms maybe, course completion percentages, you inevitably push leaders and participants towards just checking boxes.
Right, not actual change.
Exactly. It's not about genuine heart transformation anymore. The organization might proudly report, say, a 90% completion rate for a course.
Yeah.
But if the actual behavior, the character of those 90% hasn't really shifted, well, the metrics successfully measured activity or performance, but it completely failed at measuring formation.
Yeah, the classic activity versus impact trap. And I bet the temptation to just worship those easy metrics, the ones that look good on the quarterly report, is pretty strong.
It is incredibly strong. And that leads right into the second major shoal. Reductionism and subjectivity. Human development, spiritual growth, it's holistic, right?
Mhm.
It involves doctrine, emotional health, character, the fruit of the spirit stuff. Think Galatians 5. When you try to boil that rich, complex reality down to just 3 or 4 measurable inputs on a spreadsheet, you inevitably end up ignoring most of what real formation actually is.
And that reductionism, that oversimplification,
Yeah.
it leads straight back to what you call the fog of subjectivity, where everyone's arguing over vague terms. Like,
Right.
what does the system actually mean when it says someone is committed? Does that mean they show up on time? Are they generous financially? Do they handle conflict well? It could mean anything.
Precisely. And when leaders start arguing over how to apply those vague definitions, which they definitely will, based on their own biases and experiences, the measurement tool, ironically, ends up creating more noise and confusion, not less direction. The system was meant to bring clarity, but because it reduces complex character to simple checkboxes, it actually just maximizes disagreement.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting, especially for you listening if you manage a team.
Yeah.
The very system designed to help track development ends up being a major source of pain. The source material talks a lot about how poorly designed tracking systems create this huge administrative burden. Mandatory reports, endless required fields, weekly check-ins, stuff that pulls leaders away from their actual core work.
Like pastoral presence, mentoring, teaching,
Yeah.
the relational stuff.
Exactly.
And the research found something pretty horrifying. In some cases, leaders were spending up to 40% of their reporting time tracking people they weren't even directly responsible for, just to fill the boxes on the organizational scorecard.
Wow, 40%.
Yeah. And the predictable outcome of that kind of poor design is widespread data neglect. It's what the software world often calls shelfware.
Shelfware, that's brilliant. The expensive tool nobody actually uses. So how does that neglect spiral?
Well, it's a negative feedback loop, really, and it's driven by disillusionment. An organization invests heavily in collecting all this complex data, but they fail to build the crucial feedback loop that turns that data into personalized, helpful action for the individual. The leader on the ground knows the system is flawed, knows their input isn't really making a difference for the person they're tracking, so what do? They start withholding data, maybe even fudging it a bit.
Because it feels pointless.
Exactly. And then that incomplete or inaccurate data is used to justify eventually abandoning the system altogether. The result, you have people who are tracked but unhelped.
Yeah.
The whole organizational map just becomes this stagnant spreadsheet instead of a living, breathing guide for informed care.
So that's silence you might notice, where the team kind of quietly avoids talking about the data or the reports are always late or incomplete.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily laziness, is it? It sounds more like a systemic failure of foresight. The leaders see that the tool meant to bring clarity is actually just causing confusion and burnout. It's draining their energy, not focusing it.
Which is exactly why this counterintuitive shift in perspective is so vital. Instead of just seeing tracking problems, the shelfware, the burnout, the incomplete reports as annoying administrative headaches, leaders need to start seeing them as diagnostic opportunities. The sources really push us to change the question we're asking. It shouldn't be, how do we fix these broken fields in the software? It needs to be, okay, what is this faulty system telling us, about our culture, about how we're actually defining success?
So the friction points reveal deeper issues.
Every single time. Every point of friction highlights an area where the organizational culture, or maybe its very definition of growth, needs some serious refinement. Okay, so if the steward's paradox and those hidden Scholl's metrics worship reductionism define the problem, what's the solution? It has to be something that honors both our responsibility, our accountability, and the inherent mystery and growth. The sources detail this balanced alternative, often called the shepherd's map. The idea is to provide clear, often biblically rooted indicators that genuinely inform pastoral action or managerial action. But, and this is critical, it has to honor the mystery of divine work or just the unpredictable nature of human development and, crucially, the dignity of the person being tracked.
Okay, a shepherd's map. I like that image. So what's the key principle that makes this map actually work? How do you keep it useful and not just another burden? The sources say it involves a fundamental shift, moving away from relying heavily on scores and instead prioritizing signals. Scores are your typical numbers, right? Quantitative stuff, attendance rates, course completion percentages. The idea here is to use those very sparingly. They're useful maybe, but only as prompts for a real conversation, not as the final word on someone's maturity or development.
Exactly. Scores flag something, they don't define someone. And signals, on the other hand, become the primary evidence for formation or growth. Now we're talking about qualitative data, stories, testimonies, observed actions, maybe someone initiating reconciliation or making a selfless decision or demonstrating obedience or mastery in a tough situation.
So in a professional setting, signals might be things like unsolicited positive feedback about someone, or them taking initiative on a project, or voluntarily mastering a new skill that helps the team.
Perfect examples. It's the observable evidence of internal change.
And there's a core rule here, isn't there, to make this stick? Something about connecting the two.
Yes, a really powerful one. Always attach a qualitative note to any quantitative flag. Simply put, no score without a story.
No score without a story. I like that. It forces you to keep the focus squarely on the human being, not just the data point.
It really does. That rule acts as a fantastic guardrail against metrics worship. If a leader tries to submit, say, a high attendance score, but doesn't include a brief narrative note describing some instance of actual growth or struggle, well, the data is considered incomplete. It constantly forces the leader to remember you're tracking a person, not just managing a progress bar.
Okay, let's get super practical now, because this is often where things fall apart, the actual administrative side. To beat that burnout problem, the Shepherd's Map insists on intentional simplicity. What do the sources call it?
They call it minimum viable data, or MVD.
NVD.
Okay. Instead of asking leaders to fill out what most systems demand, which is basically a maximum viable data report with 50 different fields, MVD focuses on an incredibly short form. Think quick pastoral note or quick development note. It contains only 4 essential things. The person's name, naturally, a one-line snapshot. This is the leader writing a very brief story of progress or maybe a current struggle. Then the next growth step, just 1 to 3 concrete actions that have been mutually discussed and agreed upon. And finally, a follow-up date. That's it.
That's really it. Name, snapshot, next step, follow-up date.
That's the core. It radically shifts the focus from reporting endlessly on the past to proactively planning for the future.
And that future focus feels like the key difference. The MVD form sounds less like an audit and much more like a tool for focused, agreed-upon action.
Absolutely. The feedback is that it cuts the typical admin time by something like 75%, and that time gets reinvested right back into relational presence, into actual mentoring.
Okay, but if we're focusing on action, we still have that huge subjectivity problem we talked about earlier. 2 leaders looking at the same person and saying different things. How does the Shepherd's Map handle that without just adding more bureaucracy?
That's a great question, because adding bureaucracy is the last thing we want. To tackle subjectivity in assigning, say, stages of growth, the map uses the 2-signal rule. Basically, to justify changing someone's stage, like moving them from maturing to leading or developing to proficient, you need at least 2 independent signals.
2 signals.
Yeah. And ideally, one signal should be observable behavior, like they successfully led a tough meeting or they took initiative on something new. And the other should be narrative, maybe a story shared by the person themselves or by another leader, confirming some internal character growth or shift.
But wait, doesn't requiring 2 signals kind of double the admin burden we just tried to reduce? Now you need 2 data points instead of 1.
Not necessarily if we redefine data away from just form fields. The MVD system, if used consistently, ensures those signals are actually being noticed and captured as part of the normal relational rhythm. And here's the crucial part of the role. If only one signal exists right now, the default status isn't uncertainty, it's relationship. The status becomes pending mentor follow-up.
Oh, okay.
You always default back to relational presence over achieving data certainty. It builds humility right into the system's logic. It effectively tells the leader, okay, you think they've changed, you have one piece of evidence, but if you don't have that second confirming signal yet, your next step isn't updating the database, it's going back to the relationship to seek it out.
That's the relational discipline piece. Makes sense. Okay, one last crucial area the sources really hammered home, ethics and dignity. This tracking has to be pastoral, or at least deeply respectful, not invasive. That needs structural safeguards.
Absolutely essential. This demands a really robust consent and ownership policy. The person being tracked needs to know what kind of information is being recorded about their development. And critically, they must have the ability to review their confidential notes and request corrections if something's inaccurate or misconstrued.
That feels vital for trust.
It protects the individual, prevents gossip, stops the misuse of potentially sensitive relational information, and alongside that, access must be strictly limited and enforced through clear role-based permissions. Only assigned shepherds, mentors, or direct managers should see these notes. The whole system has to be explicitly designed and communicated as a tool for care, for understanding, for fostering personal growth, never, ever as surveillance or some kind of institutional control mechanism.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together for you, the listener. The real difference, it seems, between a system that genuinely helps growth and one that actually hinders it. It really boils down to two things. First, theological humility, or maybe just organizational humility, recognizing the limits of what you can control or force in someone's development. And second, relational discipline, consistently focusing on the story, the person, over just the score or the metric. The goal isn't the fastest throughput of disciples completed or employees certified or whatever the metric is. It's about the deepest, most sustained, most authentic formation of the people entrusted to your care.
Yeah, and connecting that to the bigger picture, the idea of the shepherd's eye isn't about surveillance. It's not Big Brother. It's meant to be sustained, attentive presence. It needs to be tender, but also accountable and always rooted in grace. The system fundamentally has to serve the people their dignity, their formation, not the other way around. And if the tool is consistently draining the leader, making their primary work harder, then the tool is broken, period. Doesn't matter how clever the software algorithms are.
That's a powerful bottom line.
So maybe this raises an important question for you to chew on. If any kind of tracking, whether it's in ministry or professional development, or even tracking your own personal habits, is fundamentally an act of stewardship, how do you make sure that your metrics, your systems, are genuinely serving love and action? How do you ensure they're not just creating performative compliance, or worse, falling into a kind of administrative idolatry where maintaining the system becomes the goal itself?
That's a fantastic challenge. Think about the processes you have, maybe in your own life or in your organization. Where do you need more intentional humility to keep the focus really locked on the human element? And maybe ask yourself this: what would it look like if your system didn't just measure growth, but actually actively multiplied it?